The Golden Leaf restaurant stood tall and proud on the corner of Fifth Avenue, its golden sign gleaming under the street lights. This wasn't just any restaurant, it was the place where politicians made deals, where celebrities came to be seen, and where the rich came to feel even richer. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and the soft glow of candles flickered on tables covered with crisp white cloths. Jasmine Taylor adjusted her black bow tie in the staff bathroom mirror. 28 years old with warm brown eyes that crinkled when she smiled, she had been working at the Golden Leaf for almost 3 years now. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, not a strand out of place. The management was strict about appearance. 10 minutes till doors open, called her co-worker Lewis from outside. Chef's in one of his moods again. Jasmine sighed. When isn't he? She replied, giving her reflection one last check. The uniform felt stiff and uncomfortable, but the tips were good, and she needed every dollar. As she walked through the kitchen, the smell of sizzling steaks and garlic butter made her stomach rumble. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, a hasty piece of toast, as she rushed out the door to make her early morning class. The life of a student waitress meant always being a little hungry, always being a little tired. 3 nights a week, after her shift ended at 11 p.m., Jasmine would catch the late bus to the community college. She was just 2 semesters away from finishing her music degree, a dream she'd been forced to put on hold 3 years ago when her mother got sick. Cancer was expensive and dreams had to wait. Table assignments are up, said Mai, the head waitress, tapping a sheet of paper on the wall. Jasmine, you've got the west section tonight, including the corner tables. The west section meant the piano. Jasmine's eyes drifted toward the magnificent grand piano that sat on a small raised platform. It was a Steinway, probably worth more than she'd make in 10 years. Famous musicians sometimes played there during special events, their fingers dancing across keys that Jasmine had never touched, despite how her hands itched to play whenever she walked past. Earth to Jasmine, May said, snapping her fingers. I need you focused tonight. We've got some VIPs coming in. Sorry, Jasmine said quickly. I'm ready. The doors opened and the evening began. Jasmine moved between tables with practiced grace, balancing plates and pouring wine. She had learned to make herself almost invisible, that when needed, gone when not. Rich people liked their servers that way. They liked to pretend their food appeared by magic. Your usual table is ready, Mr. Whitfield, she said with a polite smile to a regular customer. He barely nodded in response. By 8 o'clock, the restaurant was full. The noise of conversation and clinking glasses filled the air. Through it all, Jasmine kept moving, kept smiling. A man at table 12 complained his steak was overcooked. It wasn't. A woman at table 7 wanted her dressing on the side, after her salad had already been prepared. Jasmine handled it all with the same calm efficiency. Every so often, her eyes would drift to the piano. Once, when she was clearing a nearby table, she heard its rich tones. The restaurant's owner was showing it off to a guest, playing a simple scale. Even those basic notes made something stir inside her chest. If you've got time to daydream, you've got time to refill waters, said Louis as he passed by with a tray of dirty dishes. Jasmine quickly turned away from the piano. Dreams were for after work, after classes, after her mother's medical bills were paid. For now, there were water glasses to fill and bread baskets to replenish. Just after 9, the front doors swung open. The manager rushed forward, bowing slightly. Jasmine didn't need to look to know someone important had arrived. She could tell by the sudden shift in the restaurant's atmosphere, the way conversations quieted for a moment before resuming with more energy. Mr. Richardson and his party, whispered May as she hurried past. Your section. The corner table. Whatever they want, they get. Understand? Jasmine nodded. She had heard of Maxwell Richardson. Everyone in the city had. His face was on billboards advertising his luxury condos. His name was on buildings. His picture was in the business section of newspapers, usually alongside headlines about another successful deal, another $1 million made. As Jasmine approached their table, ready with her professional smile, she had no idea that this ordinary Friday night was about to change everything. The piano she'd been admiring from afar was about to play a much bigger role in her life than she ever imagined. Maxwell Richardson walked into the Golden Leaf like he owned the place. In a way, he almost did. His company held the lease on the building, a fact he never let the restaurant owner forget. He was tall, with silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Jasmine's yearly rent. Behind him trailed 5 men in similar expensive suits, laughing too loudly at something he'd just said. "Mr. Richardson, what an honor," gushed the restaurant manager, practically falling over himself to pull out the main chair at the corner table. "Your usual bottle of Chateau Margaux." "Make it 2, Richardson said without looking at him. His eyes were busy scanning the room, not to admire the decor, but to see who might be watching his entrance. He nodded to a city councilman at a nearby table, who quickly raised his glass in acknowledgement. Jasmine took a deep breath and approached with menus tucked under her arm. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the Golden Leaf." She began placing menus around the table. When she reached Richardson, he looked at her for the first time, his eyes moving from her face down to her shoes and back up again in a way that made her feel like she was being assessed rather than seen. "New girl?" he asked the manager, who was still hovering nearby. "No, sir. Jasmine has been with us for 3 years now." Richardson raised an eyebrow. Never noticed her." He said it as if this was somehow her fault. The manager laughed nervously and backed away, leaving Jasmine alone with the table of businessmen. She kept her professional smile firmly in place. "Can I start you gentlemen with some drinks while you look at the menu?" One of the men ordered an expensive scotch. Another asked for a martini with specific instructions about how dry it should be. Richardson was typing something on his phone, completely ignoring her presence. "And for you, sir?" Jasmine asked after taking the others' orders. Richardson didn't look up. "Didn't Thomas already order my wine?" "Yes, sir." "The Chateau Margaux. Would you like a water as well?" He sighed as if her question had deeply inconvenienced him. "Sparkling, no ice. With lime, not lemon. Slice, not wedge." He still hadn't looked at her. "Very good, sir. I'll be right back with your drinks." As she turned to leave, she heard one of the men say, "Man, you weren't kidding about this place. Even the help is top shelf." The table erupted in laughter. In the service area, Jasmine's hands shook slightly as she prepared their drinks. Lewis noticed and gave her a sympathetic look. "Richardson table?" he asked. She nodded. "That guy's the worst. Last month he snapped his fingers at me like I was a dog." Jasmine carefully arranged the drinks on her tray. "Just a couple more hours and then we're done." When she returned to the table, the men were in the middle of a conversation about a recent business deal. Richardson was speaking, his voice carrying through the restaurant. "So I told him, either sell now at my price, or watch as I buy up everything around him until his little shop is worthless." He laughed. "You should have seen his face. 20 years running that place, and I took it in 20 minutes. The others nodded and smiled appreciatively. Jasmine placed their drinks in front of each person. "Excuse me," Richardson said suddenly as she set down his wine. "This glass has a smudge." He held it up to the light dramatically, though Jasmine could see it was perfectly clean. "I'm very sorry, sir. Let me get you another one right away." "Don't bother," he said with a wave of his hand. "I'll manage somehow. But do tell your staff that some of us have standards." One of his companions chuckled. Another looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Throughout the meal, Richardson found reasons to complain. The bread was too cold. The steak was undercooked, then overcooked when she brought a replacement. The vegetables were arranged strangely on the plate. With each complaint, his friends grew more emboldened, joining in with their own nitpicking. "I think there's lipstick on my water glass," said one, though he'd been drinking from it for 20 minutes without issue. "Is this really the freshest fish you have?" asked another. Jasmine handled each complaint with grace, apologizing and fixing issues that didn't really exist. Other diners were starting to notice, throwing sympathetic glances her way. "Another round," Richardson demanded as they finished their main course. His face was slightly flushed from the alcohol he'd already consumed, and tell the kitchen to hurry with the dessert menu. Some of us have important places to be. As Jasmine turned to go, she heard him say, "These people simply don't understand the concept of proper service anymore. It's like they don't appreciate the opportunity to serve people like us." She kept her head high as she walked away, refusing to let them see how their words stung. What they didn't know, what they didn't care to know, was that she'd been up since 5 a.m., had taken a 3-hour biology exam, had visited her mother in the hospital during her lunch break, and had been on her feet serving people like them for the past 6 hours straight. What they couldn't see was that beneath her calm exterior, a storm was brewing, and it would only take one more spark to set it free. As the evening wore on, the volume at Maxwell Richardson's table grew louder. They were now on their 3rd bottle of expensive wine, and inhibitions were falling away with each glass. The other diners kept throwing annoyed glances their way, but nobody dared say anything. People like Richardson weren't used to being told to quiet down. Jasmine moved quickly between tables, trying to give her other customers the attention they deserved, despite the constant demands from the corner table. Every time she passed the piano, she felt a pull toward it, a momentary escape from the reality of her night. Once she paused for just a second too long, her eyes lingering on the polished black surface. Richardson noticed. Of course he did. People like him noticed everything they could use. "Bring the dessert menus," he called out, snapping his fingers twice. The sharp sound cut through the restaurant noise like a whip crack. "And don't forget my coffee. Black. Hot." Actually hot this time. Jasmine nodded and went to retrieve the menus. When she returned, Richardson was watching her with a new expression, something calculating in his eyes. "Tell me," he said as she handed out the dessert menus, "do you play?" He nodded toward the piano. The question caught her off guard. Yes, I do." He leaned back in his chair. "I find that hard to believe." One of his friends laughed. "Come on, Max, be nice." "I am being nice," Richardson said, not taking his eyes off Jasmine. "I'm making conversation with the help. Isn't that what these types are always complaining about? That we don't see them as people." Another of his companions shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Maybe we should just order dessert." Richardson ignored him. "What do you play?" "Chopsticks." He demonstrated with his fingers in the air, making a childish plinking motion. Jasmine kept her voice steady. "Classical, mostly. Some jazz." "Classical?" Richardson's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Did you hear that, gentlemen? Our waitress plays classical music." He chuckled, and a few of the men joined in, though their laughter sounded forced. The oldest man at the table, gray-haired and red-faced from drinking, spoke up. "My daughter took piano lessons for years. Cost me a fortune. Teacher was from Juilliard." "Well, I'm sure our friend here had the same advantages," Richardson said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jasmine felt heat rising in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. "Will you be ordering dessert, sir?" Richardson wasn't ready to let it go. "You know what I think," he said, pushing his chair back slightly. "I think you're just saying that. I mean, no offense, but look at you." He gestured vaguely at her uniform, at her hands. "You don't exactly scream classical musician to me." The restaurant had grown quieter. People at nearby tables were pretending not to listen, but Jasmine could feel their attention. The manager was nowhere in sight, probably hiding in his office, hoping the situation would resolve itself. "I don't need to prove anything to you, sir," Jasmine said quietly. "Now, about your dessert." "But I'm curious now," Richardson interrupted, his voice growing louder. He was enjoying himself, putting on a show. "What would you play if you had the chance? Something sophisticated, I bet." One of the men at the table, younger than the rest, looked genuinely embarrassed. "Max, come on. Let's drop it." No. I want to know." Richardson reached into his jacket and pulled out a money clip. He peeled off several $100 bills and placed them on the table with a flourish. "What do you say?" "A little performance for my friends and me." The restaurant was deadly silent now. Everyone was watching. Jasmine felt as if she was standing on a cliff edge, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. "I'm working, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll make it worth your while." Richardson added another $100 bill to the stack. $500 for one song. That's probably more than you make in a week, isn't it? One of his friends laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that seemed to hang in the air. "Go on," Richardson pressed, grinning now. "Show us what you can do. Unless," he paused dramatically, "unless you're lying about being able to play." Jasmine stood frozen, her serving tray clutched against her chest like a shield. $500 was almost half her monthly rent. It was 3 textbooks. It was a week of her mother's medication. But the way he was looking at her, like she was something to be toyed with, something less than human, made the money seem filthy somehow. "I don't think," she began. "Let me guess," Richardson cut in, his voice louder now. "You took a few lessons at the community center, played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and now you consider yourself a pianist." A couple of his friends chuckled, though others looked increasingly uncomfortable. "That's not." "Or maybe," Richardson said, leaning forward, "maybe you just like to stand there and stare at things you can't have." Something shifted in Jasmine's chest. A lifetime of swallowing insults, of being underestimated, of working twice as hard to get half as far. It all came to a point, sharp and clear. "Sir," she said, and there was a new tone in her voice that made Richardson's smirk falter, "I would be happy to play for you." She set down her tray, straightened her uniform, and walked toward the piano. Behind her, Richardson's voice followed, dripping with mockery. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special treat tonight. Our own—" "What was your name again?" "Jasmine. Our own Jasmine will grace us with a musical selection." A few of the men at his table clapped, but the rest of the restaurant remained uncomfortably silent. As Jasmine approached the piano, she heard one woman whisper to her dying companion, "This is horrible. Someone should stop this." But nobody did. Nobody ever did. Jasmine reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, running her fingers lightly over the polished wood. 3 years of walking past it every day, of imagining what it would feel like to play. Not like this, she had thought. Not as a joke, not as the punchline to some rich man's cruel game. But here she was. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. The keys gleamed up at her, white and black, familiar and strange all at once. Behind her, she could hear Richardson making another comment, followed by laughter. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes for just a moment, and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The walk to the piano felt like the longest journey of Jasmine's life. Each step echoed in her mind, along with Richardson's mocking laughter and the uncomfortable silence of the other diners. Her hands trembled slightly, and her mouth had gone dry. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to walk through those double doors, to rip off her name tag, and never come back to this place again. $500 sat on that table. $500 that could help with her mother's medical bills. $500 that she desperately needed. But at what cost to her dignity? As she reached the piano bench, memories washed over her. She remembered her first teacher, Mrs. Wilson, an elderly woman with arthritic hands who charged next to nothing because she said Jasmine had the gift. She remembered practicing on a second-hand keyboard her mother had bought from a pawn shop, the middle C key sticking every third press. She remembered the scholarship audition at Juilliard, how the judges had leaned forward in their seats when she played Rachmaninoff, their faces showing first surprise, then appreciation. And she remembered the phone call 3 years ago that had changed everything. Her mother's voice, trying to sound strong even as it broke with the news of her diagnosis. The immediate decision to put her education on hold. The gradual selling off of everything valuable they owned to pay for treatments insurance wouldn't cover. The restaurant had fallen completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had paused their work, peering through the service window. The manager stood by the bar, his face a mask of worry. He wouldn't stop this. He would never stand up to a man like Richardson. Jasmine sat down at the piano bench and adjusted it, buying herself a few seconds to think. Behind her, she could hear Richardson stage whispering to his friends. "Watch this. $10 says she can barely play Happy Birthday." Anger flared in her chest, hot and sudden. She had spent her entire life being underestimated by people like him. People who looked at her and saw only what they expected to see. People who never bothered to look deeper, to see the dreams and talents beneath the surface. But anger wouldn't serve her now. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the way Mrs. Wilson had taught her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let everything else fall away. When she opened her eyes again, she was calmer. She flexed her fingers and placed them lightly on the keys. The piano was beautiful, perfectly tuned, its action smooth and responsive. Whatever happened next, at least she would have played on a real Steinway once in her life. A small voice in her head whispered that she should just play something simple. Give them what they expected. Take the money and be done with it. Why expose something so personal, so precious to these people who wouldn't understand or appreciate it? Yet a stronger voice reminded her of what her mother always said: never shrink yourself to make others comfortable with your light. Her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to pay for those piano lessons, who had sat through countless recitals, beaming with pride, who had cried tears of joy when the Juilliard acceptance letter came, even though they both knew they couldn't afford the living expenses in New York without substantial help. Her mother, who now spent her days in a hospital bed but still asked Jasmine to play for her on that old keyboard they brought to her room. "We're waiting," Richardson called out, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "Or should we take our money elsewhere?" That was the moment Jasmine made her decision. She would not play for him. She would not play for the money. She would play for herself, for her mother, for every person who had ever been made to feel small by someone like Maxwell Richardson. She would play the piece she had been practicing for her graduation recital before life intervened. A piece so technically demanding that half her class wouldn't attempt it. A piece that told a story of darkness and light, of struggle and triumph. Jasmine took another deep breath, positioned her fingers over the keys, and began to play the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The first few notes hung in the air, gentle and questioning. She played softly, drawing the listeners in. This was just the beginning, the calm before the storm. She could almost feel Richardson's smug satisfaction, his certainty that this simple melody was all she was capable of. But Jasmine knew what was coming. She knew every note, every dynamic shift, every emotional peak and valley of this piece. She had played it in her dreams on countless nights. And now, on this perfect piano, before an audience that expected nothing from her, she would play it the way it deserved to be played. As the piece began to build, her fingers moved faster, more confidently. The melody grew more complex, the harmonies richer. She leaned into the keys, letting the music flow through her, forgetting the restaurant, forgetting Richardson, forgetting everything except the conversation between her fingers and the piano. From the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of Richardson's face, his smug smile fading into confusion. She didn't need to look to know what would happen next. The confusion would turn to disbelief, then to shock. It happened every time someone underestimated her. But this time it felt different. This time it felt like freedom. The first minute of Jasmine's playing had already silenced the entire restaurant. By the second minute, forks were suspended in midair, conversations completely forgotten. By the third minute, even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen, standing in a line by the service door with wide eyes and parted lips. What they were witnessing wasn't just good playing. It wasn't even excellent playing. It was the kind of performance that comes along once in a generation, fingers moving with such speed and precision that they almost blurred, yet every note ringing out with perfect clarity. The Chopin Ballade built like a gathering storm, starting with gentle raindrops before unleashing its full power. Jasmine's small frame seemed to grow larger at the piano, her back straightening, her shoulders rising and falling with each emotional surge in the music. Her face transformed too. Gone was the careful mask of the patient waitress. In its place was the face of an artist completely absorbed in her craft. An older couple at a nearby table exchanged glances of astonishment. The woman mouthed the word incredible to her husband, who nodded, unable to take his eyes off Jasmine's hands. When the piece reached its first climax, Jasmine attacked the keys with a ferocity that made several people gasp. The restaurant's perfect acoustics caught every nuance, every dynamic shift. The normally chatty bartender stood frozen, a cocktail shaker forgotten in his hand, ice slowly melting inside. One of the kitchen staff, a young dishwasher who had never heard classical music in his life, felt tears spring to his eyes without understanding why. The music spoke a language he didn't know he understood until this moment. Richardson's table had fallen completely silent. The smirks were gone, replaced by expressions ranging from disbelief to embarrassment to genuine wonder. Richardson himself sat rigid in his chair, the wine glass in his hand tilted at a dangerous angle, its contents threatening to spill onto his expensive suit. He didn't notice or care. As Jasmine moved into the middle section of the piece, her touch became impossibly light, like butterfly wings on the keys. The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. An elderly man near the window closed his eyes, his face a map of emotions as the music carried him to places in his memory he thought he'd forgotten. The piece demanded everything of its performer: control, power, delicacy, and most of all, emotion. The audience could feel Jasmine pouring her life into every note, her struggles, her dreams, her disappointments, and her hopes. It was as if they were hearing her story told not in words but in music. When she reached the technically challenging runs, the part that separated accomplished pianists from true virtuosos, her fingers flew across the keyboard with such precision that several people shook their heads in disbelief. A woman who had studied piano for 20 years turned to her companion and whispered, "I couldn't play that passage after a year of practice." Lewis, who had worked alongside Jasmine for 3 years without knowing about her talent, stood by the service station, his mouth hanging open. The manager, who had been too afraid to stand up to Richardson earlier, now looked like he might faint from shock. As the piece built toward its dramatic conclusion, Jasmine's whole body seemed to be playing, not just her hands. She swayed slightly, drawing out the emotional core of each phrase, bringing listeners to the edge of their seats. The restaurant was transformed. It was no longer a place for expensive meals and business deals. For these minutes, it had become a concert hall. The waitress uniform no longer mattered. The color of her skin no longer mattered. Nothing mattered except the music and the extraordinary talent they were witnessing. Richardson's youngest associate, who had been uncomfortable with the bullying from the start, found himself completely transported. He had attended classical concerts his whole life, had heard some of the world's greatest pianists, but there was something about this, the unexpectedness of it, the raw emotion behind it, that moved him like nothing he'd experienced before. A professional photographer dining with his wife reached slowly for his camera, trying not to make a sound as he captured this remarkable moment. His hands trembled slightly as he framed the shot. Jasmine at the piano, her face illuminated by the soft overhead lights, her fingers a graceful blur over the keys, with Richardson visible in the background, his face a picture of absolute shock. As the piece entered its final section, Jasmine seemed to play even more freely, as if having proven herself, she could now simply enjoy the music. Her face softened into something close to joy. This was who she was meant to be. This was what she was meant to do. The final page of the ballade contained some of the most difficult passages in piano literature, octave runs that required absolute precision, rolled chords that needed to sound like bells, and a closing section that demanded both delicacy and power. Jasmine played them all as if they were as natural as breathing. When she struck the final chord, letting it ring through the restaurant, time seemed to stop. For several heartbeats, no one moved, no one breathed. The notes hung in the air like something precious and fragile that no one wanted to disturb. And then, from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, a single pair of hands began to clap. Lewis, who had worked alongside Jasmine for 3 years without knowing about her talent, stood by the service station, his mouth hanging open. The manager, who had been too afraid to stand up to Richardson earlier, now looked like he might faint from shock. As the piece built toward its dramatic conclusion, Jasmine's whole body seemed to be playing, not just her hands. She swayed slightly, drawing out the emotional core of each phrase, bringing listeners to the edge of their seats. The restaurant was transformed. It was no longer a place for expensive meals and business deals. For these minutes, it had become a concert hall. The waitress uniform no longer mattered. The color of her skin no longer mattered. Nothing mattered except the music and the extraordinary talent they were witnessing. Richardson's youngest associate, who had been uncomfortable with the bullying from the start, found himself completely transported. He had attended classical concerts his whole life, had heard some of the world's greatest pianists, but there was something about this, the unexpectedness of it, the raw emotion behind it, that moved him like nothing he'd experienced before. A professional photographer dining with his wife reached slowly for his camera, trying not to make a sound as he captured this remarkable moment. His hands trembled slightly as he framed the shot. Jasmine at the piano, her face illuminated by the soft overhead lights, her fingers a graceful blur over the keys, with Richardson visible in the background, his face a picture of absolute shock. As the piece entered its final section, Jasmine seemed to play even more freely, as if having proven herself, she could now simply enjoy the music. Her face softened into something close to joy. This was who she was meant to be. This was what she was meant to do. The final page of the ballade contained some of the most difficult passages in piano literature, octave runs that required absolute precision, rolled chords that needed to sound like bells, and a closing section that demanded both delicacy and power. Jasmine played them all as if they were as natural as breathing. When she struck the final chord, letting it ring through the restaurant, time seemed to stop. For several heartbeats, no one moved. No one breathed. The notes hung in the air like something precious and fragile that no one wanted to disturb. And then, from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, a single pair of hands began to clap. The single pair of hands clapping quickly turned into a thunderous applause. It rolled through the restaurant like a wave, building and building until the sound seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers. People rose to their feet, napkins falling unnoticed to the floor. One woman dabbed tears from her eyes. A man in the corner shouted "Bravo!" like he was at Carnegie Hall. Jasmine sat still for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the keys. Her eyes were closed, her breathing steady. She looked as if she had just returned from a journey to some place very far away. Richardson sat frozen at his table, his mouth slightly open. One of his associates leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Richardson's face changed from shock to disbelief as he listened. "That's not possible," he muttered, but his eyes told a different story. At the same time, the restaurant manager, Thomas, had scurried over to another of Richardson's dinner companions, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who was applauding enthusiastically. The manager bent down and spoke rapidly into the man's ear, gesturing toward Jasmine. The man's eyebrows shot up, and he immediately turned to Richardson. "Max," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the continuing applause. "Max, do you have any idea who that is?" Richardson shook his head, still staring at Jasmine, who was now standing beside the piano, giving a small, graceful bow to the audience. "That's Jasmine Taylor," the man continued, excitement making his voice rise. "I was on the admissions committee at Juilliard when she auditioned. She was the talk of the department. Perfect technique, perfect interpretation, perfect pitch. She got a full scholarship, the Thompson-Williams Award, only given to one pianist every 5 years." Richardson's face drained of color. "Juilliard?" He repeated, the word barely audible. "She was being groomed for international competitions," the man went on, warming to his subject. "Her professors said she had the potential to be one of the greats. Then she disappeared in her 3rd year. Nobody knew what happened to her." The restaurant manager, emboldened by the positive reception to Jasmine's playing, joined the conversation. "Her mother got sick," he said. "Cancer. Jasmine had to drop out to take care of her. She's been working here for 3 years, taking night classes at the community college to finish her degree. And the piece she just played," the associate continued, his voice filled with wonder. "Chopin's First Ballade. It's one of the most technically challenging pieces in the entire piano repertoire. Most professional pianists won't attempt it in public. It was supposed to be her graduation recital piece." Richardson stared at his associate, then back at Jasmine, who was now making her way back toward the serving station, head held high, the applause still following her. "But why didn't you tell me she was some kind of prodigy?" Richardson demanded of the manager. The manager spread his hands helplessly. "I didn't know, sir. None of us knew. She never mentioned it. Never played here before tonight." At a nearby table, an elegant older woman in a designer dress was speaking excitedly to her husband. "That was world-class playing, Harold. World-class. Like that Korean pianist we saw last month at Lincoln Center. Maybe even better." Her husband nodded. "Imagine finding that kind of talent here serving us dinner. It's unbelievable." All around the restaurant, similar conversations were taking place. A music teacher was explaining to her confused date just how difficult the piece was that they had just heard. A group of college students were frantically Googling on their phones, trying to find information about Jasmine Taylor's competition history. Meanwhile, Jasmine had returned to the service station, straightening her uniform as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Louis stood there, mouth agape. You play like that and you're working here," he finally managed to say. Jasmine shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Life happens," she said simply. "But that was amazing. Like professional amazing." Louis insisted. "I was professional, or I was going to be." Jasmine picked up a water pitcher, ready to continue her shift. "Table 12 needs refills." Lewis shook his head in disbelief but moved aside to let her pass. Across the room, Richardson was still struggling to process what had happened. His face had cycled through shock, disbelief, and embarrassment, finally settling on something that looked almost like shame. "I need to apologize," he muttered to his associates, half rising from his chair. "You sure do," said the youngest one, no longer afraid to speak his mind. But before Richardson could make his way to Jasmine, a distinguished-looking man in a perfectly tailored suit intercepted her by the water station. He handed her a business card, which she studied with a confused expression. Richardson's associate with the wire-rimmed glasses recognized the man instantly. "That's William Chen," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "He's on the board of the City Symphony Orchestra." All eyes in the restaurant were now on this new interaction. William Chen was speaking earnestly to Jasmine, who looked stunned. He gestured toward the piano, then back to her, clearly making some kind of offer. Jasmine's hand went to her throat in surprise. Richardson sank back into his chair, the $500 he'd offered earlier still lying untouched on the table. It looked sad and insignificant now, a cruel joke rather than a generous gesture. "She was working on Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto when she left Juilliard," his associate was saying, still shaking his head in wonder. "The professors said she was the only student in a decade who could handle it. And we just—" He looked at Richardson accusingly. "We just humiliated her." Richardson couldn't meet his eyes. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, Maxwell Richardson found himself completely and utterly speechless. The last note hung in the air as Jasmine's fingers lifted from the keys. For a moment, the restaurant was completely silent. Then, as if a dam broke, the room erupted in wild applause. People jumped to their feet, clapping so hard their hands turned red. Some wiped tears from their eyes. An older woman near the back kept saying, "Incredible, just incredible," over and over. Jasmine stood up from the piano bench, gave a small bow, and straightened her waitress uniform. Her heart was racing, but her face remained calm as she walked back toward her serving station. Every person she passed reached out to touch her arm or shoulder, offering words of praise and amazement. Maxwell sat frozen in his chair. His face had turned the color of old paper, and sweat beaded on his forehead. The friends who had laughed with him earlier now avoided looking at him. One of them whispered, "You really stepped in it this time." Jasmine picked up her serving tray and continued working as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had changed in how she carried herself. Her shoulders were straighter, her steps more confident. The shame he tried to put on her had bounced right back to him. "Miss? Excuse me, miss." A well-dressed woman approached Jasmine with purpose in her steps. "I'm Diane Powell, board member with the City Symphony." She handed Jasmine a business card with gold lettering. "We should talk. Soon." Other diners came forward too. A college professor promised to speak with the music department head about her situation. A local business owner slipped her his card, mentioning a charity foundation that helped promising artists. From across the room, Jasmine noticed a young girl pointing at her, excitement lighting up her face as she tapped on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, she looks like me, and she plays better than my teacher." Later, as the crowd thinned, Maxwell approached her, his earlier arrogance replaced by awkward shame. "I'd like to pay for the rest of your education," he said, pulling out his checkbook. "Whatever it costs." Jasmine looked at him steadily. "No thank you," she said. Her voice was gentle but firm. "I appreciate the offer, but this isn't about money." What Maxwell didn't understand was that she didn't need his charity anymore. A diner had recorded her entire performance on his phone. By midnight, the video had already been shared thousands of times online. By morning, it would reach hundreds of thousands of views, with comments flooding in from around the world. The restaurant owner, who had watched everything unfold, approached Jasmine as she prepared to leave for the night. "The piano is yours whenever you want to practice," he told her. "And we'll work around your new schedule, whatever that may be." She found 3 messages on her phone when her shift ended. One from the university offering to reinstate her scholarship, another from a local news station wanting an interview, and a third from a community organization that had started an online fundraiser for her. It had already raised enough to cover a year of her expenses. As Jasmine walked to the bus stop that night, she looked up at the stars and thought about how quickly life could change. Just hours ago, she had been just another struggling waitress, swallowing her pride to pay the bills. Now paths were opening that she had thought closed forever. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Someone just sent me a video of you playing. I'm crying. So proud." Jasmine smiled. The man had tried to use the piano to humiliate her. Instead, it had reconnected her with the music that lived inside her all along. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to unexpected beginnings. She hadn't just stood up for herself tonight. She'd reminded herself who she truly was. And that was worth more than all the tip money in the world.